Hello and welcome to the Mediaverse Lounge. I'm Blu Topalli, your host for tonight's show with guest panelist Ivo Heyning, co-founder of Playable Agency, Toy Shop, and founder of Light Lodges. Welcome, Ivo. That is some resume, and I'll give you a chance to walk us through some of that in a moment. The subject of tonight's show is the XR producer's dilemma, where Ivo and I will be discussing the evolving XR industry, specifically audience inclusivity, access to distribution channels and tools through the lens of the XR producer. First of all, I want to give a shout out to our avatar audience on set and our audience at home on Twitch. We are shooting this with a live simulcast, so this is yet another milestone on just the second episode of our burgeoning show here at the Mediaverse Lounge. We'll also be doing a short Q&A with our audience on set here at the end of the show, so sit tight, that'll be coming up. And of course, another shout out to my fellow producer, Larry Rosenthal, who is kindly operating on camera tonight with our illustrious first cameraman, 3D Johnny, or 3D John rather. Normally Larry is hosting. I'm more like the Ed McMahon on the show, but Larry's been under the heavy influence of Claritin and Sudafeds all week. So Larry will let us know if you start seeing any pink elephants here, but otherwise we're going to get on with the show here. Now, some of you in our live avatar audience and watching at home on Twitch may know Ivo from her vast career as a producer in XR and on over 50 media campaigns, including actually the Affordable Care Act, which was a huge success in getting a lot of people signed up. I think it was over 7 million, if I'm right, Ivo, just incredible. She's also an expert in community management and engagement strategy. Welcome, Ivo Heyning.
So hi, I'm Ivo. Nice to meet you all. I am a creator, a producer in this space and many other metaverses. I began producing in virtual worlds in 2005 in Second Life. And prior to that, worked at the intersection of media, technology, and specifically social impact. And so that included all sorts of things, designing campaigns, designing features and media projects, designing companies or systems or workflows. And I've done a number of projects that include some international endeavors.
Well, I'm not sure where we left off on my introduction, but I know that you've been obviously, you've been in this for a long time. I'd love to hear a little example of kind of what you've been into right now in terms of XR that you're producing today, and talk us through a little bit of how you're kind of dealing and grappling with some of these issues as you go.
Sure. So I had started Playable Agency at the beginning of the year, and we quickly pivoted to virtual events as our primary because as COVID drastically changed our business model, we found that an experiential agency needed to be virtual first right now. So we've been building virtual events, including conferences, festivals, art shows. The work that I was just describing with the Buckminster Fuller Institute is the Design Science Lab, and there will be a project that will be coming out next year with that. And other types of virtual experiences, whether they're 2D, streaming, and 3D, but also things that are in many different platforms, some all virtual and some all mobile. So figuring out how to bring together people for these collaborative conversations, whether they're trying to generate something at the other side, maybe publish something together, or it's what we're doing tonight, which is a streaming conversation that other people can participate, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous.
Right, exactly. Well, definitely, I know that you work across a lot of different platforms. You're not just working in VR, which is really interesting. And one thing I want to just jump right in here because again, I'm not sure where we left off on my intro, but we're dealing a lot with some recent developments in VR actually, and we have a lot of folks in our audience today who are looking toward the future of XR and trying to get a handle on some of the recent developments in the world of distribution. And so, what do you think about what's happened with Facebook and Oculus? There is a lot of friction over their mandatory sign-in with Facebook, and how do you think that kind of strategic move is shaping the way that we may ultimately be, forced to produce and consume content in VR in certain ways.
It is becoming this huge rift, so to speak,
Right.
if you want to call it that. There are going to end up being two camps. It's almost like VHS and beta in that way. Either you develop for Oculus or you kind of avoid the whole ecosystem. And unfortunately, that's what's happening because of the way it's become such a siloed experience that you cannot engage unless you have a Facebook account. So there are people who are for example, publishing journalists who are quite angry about this because they deactivate their Facebook accounts and no longer can use their Oculus. And they're writing about it. So I think that's going to bite them in terms of a strategy long term. That's not necessarily the best way to roll. But also, if in terms of the broader distribution frameworks, we're looking at huge gaps right now, right? So most people, if you're trying to publish across as many ecosystems as possible, you're publishing to the web, you're publishing to Oculus if you can get in, you're publishing to Steam if you can get in, you might be publishing to other app stores, whether it's the iOS, Android, if it's a mobile application or something else. And many of those app stores are so tightly restricted when it comes to content that they will accept, right? So this week I was speaking to the producer of Queer Skins, Ilya. Amazing team, award-winning content, can't distribute. VR stories that are games cannot distribute.
Right. So let's get into that, because there's a lot of folks today, even in this room and people watching on Twitch and elsewhere that, have been incredibly frustrated. And, there are just a lot of audiences that are being actively left out of the XR landscape. As you know, just as you mentioned, if you're in the LGBTQ community or other communities seen as outside the, quote unquote mainstream, you're actively being blocked from distribution by some of these tech gatekeepers. So, we're talking about, PG content here. It's nothing racy, but, by that same token, you've got other groups that are, specifically geared towards advocacy for education or minority advocacy. And, they're getting pushed out as well with the emphasis on gaming. So where do these folks go?
Well, right now they're going to itch.io. They're going to SideQuest sometimes if they can make that work for them. They're sometimes on the open web, but then you've got almost no audience unless you're working with partners. So the open web will work if you've got a great Marcom, like that's a branded experience play. That's where it works. Otherwise, that's not really going to fly. And then if you are some sort of story, you really need to be a part of a network that's going to push that story to an audience. And you just don't have that opportunity space. Itch.io is really difficult to build audience right now. It's certainly working for some niche experiences, but not that many. And then discovery in general has been the challenge that we've seen many producers hitting. They don't have big marketing budgets. They're independent producers. They're going to places like Indiecade or other festivals. But beyond our industry, no one's going to talk about that experience or, spread it out to someone with a very wide audience, right? So there is a gap again.
Yeah. So if you're, I'm just going to throw examples out here, but like, let's say you're trying to get a show in VR done on, say, educating the public about transgender issues. Where are you going to get that funding? Because isn't it harder when funding is keenly aware that you have, a host of distribution channels being closed off to you? Can we get viable audience by distributing through something like, Playworks or platform cooperatives or showcases that are direct to sell?
I think the direct to sell, working with both public sector and private sector, they do need to be interesting partnerships that have to be formed around these types of showcases. So you and I were talking earlier about the power of bringing curated showcases together, right? So bringing together maybe like a hub and spoke model like we have here in hubs, but taking one of these sort of more decentralized networked models, taking the showcase and then offering it, whether it's to domes and museums. There's generally the if you're in nonprofit spaces, for example, in LGBTQ nonprofits, you have Pride, right? So there's a
Right.
whole programming cycle that happens next summer that people are already starting to aim for. So if we already know that next summer may or may not be safe for big public gatherings yet, then having these kinds of showcases becomes an asset and a value. So
Right. And you start
figuring
talking
out the
early.
value is key.
Right. You got to start talking early and strategically with those types of advocacy groups and start trying to sell them the opportunity that XR can provide them in lieu of basically face to face interaction. Given that we're dealing with a pandemic right now,
Right.
and I guess uh, I feel like um, I want to get a little bit into just some of these specific alternate distribution channels. How some of these folks can leverage, or which channels you think are best to leverage for some of more audience reach. And this can be just in general, the XR producer going out there and saying, "Hey, I'm new to this platform. I'm new to basically going, cross-platform with VR." What would you advise producers out there trying to navigate to audiences that really, maybe they either aren't served by these larger platforms or they're just looking for an alternate form of distribution to avoid some of the expenses
Generally
of.
depends, right? So if you're talking about a synchronous experience, right? So let's
Right.
say sometimes I work with producers and creators with high profile music artists, for example. In that case, you want them in a place like Wave, like the Wave XR, where they can do concerts that are VR ready and live and feel participatory for the audience. There are maybe half a dozen good platforms for doing music, and that's a very different type of experience than like let's say watching a 360 film. 360 film actually works better in hubs or engage than just about anywhere else. There are very few platforms that deal with 360 film content well, right, in video form.
Right.
And the number of 360 video makers are pretty much just putting their stuff up on YouTube for free and that's it. They're not able to really monetize or figure out a good distribution strategy for that type of content. The whole 360 market is pretty messed up right now. There's a handful of licensing markets, that sort of thing. But the private licensing market is going to be small. Same with the journalism market. So there's a handful
Yeah.
of 360 producers who work with the New York Times, for example, and other news outlets. But that's a very small market. We're seeing, maybe somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people watching most of these stories. So outside of the film festival market, there is an audience for it. I do think that once VR audiences become more savvy, many people are still getting into their headsets for the first time, or this is their first year with a headset, right? So they're trying things like alt space, they're, in tilt brush, they're maybe, playing in Supernatural or they're doing Beat Saber, stuff like that.
Right.
As people have their year 2, year 3 experiences, they start to explore new types of things. And that's where it becomes interesting to say, hey, can we do data viz around climate change while we talk about this stuff together? And that's what's hard right now. If you're talking about, let's say, data modeling, who does that well? I'm curious because this is a very savvy audience. Who does, if you're trying to do complex 3D data modeling together in a collaborative framework, how do you do that now?
Right. How do you go about doing that? I think we're really at the beginning of a lot of these areas and a lot of these, potentials. Um, I think I think one of the things I wanted to ask was really about, reflecting on the decision makers right now. When we look at the power structure it still leans pretty hard toward being run by, you know, generally maybe some emotionally stunted white men. I hate to say that, but and that's not a direct at all the other wonderful white male allies, but obviously, but I want to talk a little bit about that because we've got to talk about decision makers, creators, and consumers here. And I'd like to kind of walk through that for everybody about really where we are at right now and really what the potential for the future is. It's a serious systemic issue. It's not just, at the forefront of our conversations about, FANG or distribution, but really the conversation that the country itself is having.
Right.
And it's affecting us here, even, of course, in this, because we've had 40 years of doing things, in media. We've gone through the advertisers, and what we ended up with is, really, in some respects, not such a great situation, right, for creators. It's not such a great situation for the public. So,
No,
what do
it's a
we? How do
challenging
we walk through that?
situation.
Mhm.
It's such a deep and challenging situation. I
I don't want
was
to put
at
you on the hot
Mozilla.
spot, by the way, because we're talking about a
Yeah.
lot of controversial stuff.
Yeah,
But
no, it's and we've watched, a couple of cycles now of amazing leaders rise and fall through these organizations because we've seen, for example, I was at Mozilla at XR Studio with 30 amazing women and non-binary leaders.
right,
And some of those folks went to Google or to Oculus. And one is doing some really cool work with the MSG Sphere. But many of us, and in terms of being able to carve an independent path in this industry, only one was able to really get funding for an initiative. And most found that they had to go to a place like Oculus in order to make a living, which is, I think, frustrating for some people, not for everyone, but for some. Um, there are others who have been extremely successful in being able to fundraise and build new ventures in this environment, because there are so many opportunity spaces in XR for health or for enterprise or for bias training, for self-defense training, for COVID
right,
care.
right.
There's so many opportunity spaces. It's a wide open terrain. At the same time, obviously, many other industries have not been able to cope with COVID, while this one has been better suited for it. So some of these companies have found that they've been able to not just weather this particular storm of this year, they've been able to grow faster, right? So in
Right.
virtual events, for example, that's been growing very quickly, and we've been able to train a number of producers to do a little bit like what we're doing tonight, create an experience zone, stream, bring people
Right.
together, teach people how to interact effectively in those
Do you
environments.
think that there's a chasm to leap though for a lot of the, I mean, when we talk to people who are in events management, there is a little bit of for some of them,
Huge.
they're not familiar, right? They're not familiar with this medium. It's a little intimidating.
Yeah.
What do you think? How far do you think we are towards getting more of those folks?
Early stage, right? So
Yeah,
everyone's sort of getting comfortable with Zoom, and that's where we're at, right?
I
So
know.
3D
Yeah.
environments are still pretty new. I'm developing a course right now that will invite both producers and event folk of all stripes to be able to learn how to do more advanced interactive events.
Which
And so
platform are you doing that in? Which platform
um,
is it?
I'm we're still deciding exactly how we're going to publish that because we may
Okay.
publish it differently for filmmakers,
Yep.
um, and do a hybrid course as well. So I've
Okay.
been creating both the 3D environment for that, and I like using hubs. Actually, I use hubs quite a bit in terms of my own development.
Right.
I sometimes collaborate in spatial. I use Jitsi quite a bit to just create live streaming rooms where I might be using OBS or StreamYard and other tools to sort of mix across the metaverses.
Right.
But I like to really play in these sort of lightweight open web environments, especially.
Excellent. I like to spotlight user-generated content. can you walk me through kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly on that? How are we dealing with licensing issues and so forth? Is that something that you're familiar with and you can talk to?
Oof.
I imagine it is. I know it is already.
It all depends on your platform, right? So your your EULA and your terms vary depending on which headset you're in, which
Right.
environment and platform you're in, right? So in Oculus, they own everything. You're doing everything in their world. You own nothing.
Right.
That's not the world I choose to be in. So if I'm in a headset, I have an HTC, I use that. I have an HP headset, a deaf headset. I'll sometimes use that as well. So it's greatly dependent on the choices you're making, right? So we're in an open web environment where the objects we own, we have some ownership over them, but we can't monetize in this environment. There are relatively few social VR worlds that are monetizing right now. Probably to deal with risk. There's enough conversations about risk happening in terms of interactivity right now. Let's say, like Section 230 in our U.S. Penal in our legal code, in terms of how user-generated content is being dealt with and how
You want to walk some of us through that?
Ah.
I don't want to get too technical, but
see how much of that I'm going to be able to do effectively, because it's this is a code from the 90s, if I recall correctly. And specifically, Section 230 speaks to user-generated content and legal liability for content that people put on your platform. So let's say someone incites something terrible using your platform. Is the platform holder liable for that content? And this is what allowed for user-generated content to thrive, because platforms were not held liable for what the creators did on those platforms. Generally, that is the sort of open baseline that is provided by Section 230 currently. It is likely to be regulated and changed. And so that is a cautious play that many platforms are making right now in terms of how they curate and how they choose which types of content they'll allow and not allow. So obviously many worlds are designed to be family friendly, right? So Altspace, we were talking about earlier, is by Microsoft. It's now owned by Microsoft, and they are very clear that most content is for the family audience, unless it is specifically now created for and encoded for an adult audience only. And they have just started to create those separations. Second Life, a whole different type of world, obviously, chose to create Teen Second Life because they needed to create that sort of, safer zone for younger people to engage.
Is that what we need to be doing? I mean, do we need to be kind of, is it regulating, outlawing? I mean,
no, I would hope for more like Animal Crossing in terms of, I love the social worlds that are not just pro-social, but a little bit protopian in their worldview. And so giving people an opportunity to socialize in meaningful ways, and whether that's, collaboration, like in Spatial IO, being able to have a meeting room together and do all the sorts of post-it note kind of activities you would do if you were in a real conference room together. Those are meaningful spaces, and there's value to that. Or going into Engage and having a simulated experience where you're on the moon together and you're having that whole education conversation. That's value. And we haven't really figured out the value of that, nor have we figured out how to return that value to the creator. And that's the piece that's vital in order to fix what we've got going on right now. Because if we don't make a circular economy where the value of the content gets back to the creators, they don't have the money to make any more content. And so we keep running people out of business. We are bankrupting our producers and our creators. And unless they figure out how to take VC money or they figure out another way to monetize through partnerships, they're generally, second mortgages and other types of, going deeper in debt in order to create content that they can't monetize.
Right, and that's really the crux of this conversation today is really kind of how are we going to, really as creators also protect ourselves, band together, and start creating some of these economic models. I have, we all have had the tendency to kind of look back and say these are the mistakes of previous models, of predecessors. And we kind of look to the past and, history, maybe it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And we're looking now at this situation, but I don't necessarily always just want to look back and say, okay, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. What has worked that we can kind of take from the past and say, yeah, let's use little pieces here and there to kind of start creating this, right? To start creating this economic model.
Right. So, well, we're in a space that's working right now in terms of a relatively open web space where people can create their own rooms and experiences and network them in order to share media. So, minus the economic model, which is still missing from this framework, this is one layer of an ecosystem that could be a participatory media network. But what's missing, right? What's missing is tools to search and discover and go between all of the different rooms and experience zones, ability to stay social, persistence, and all of the ways in which, like other metaverses, provide a sense of continuity and a sense of being able to find your friends over and over again, right? So this is something that's working very well in alt space. So for example, the folks who went to Burning Man and BRCVR are finding great value in having regular events in alt space now. And it's becoming quite a lively scene again. And alt space was not necessarily a lively scene pre-COVID. Like there wasn't necessarily a ton of action going on there.
Right. You're involved with the Burning Man folks, or you've just been to some of the events. I think you're involved with
on the Burning Man art team in the physical playa for many years, and so I helped early on to conceptualize the idea of using multiple metaverses and really giving the community as much control over that creation experience as possible so that, you have the same spirit of user-generated content that Burning Man provides. And what they've seen is that certain types of platforms provided better stickiness for the community. So BRCVR and AltSpace, which they had designed years ago, Greg and Doug, and they had really been spending quite a few years thinking about how to translate the experience. And so they really have given something to the community that's a thoughtful, long-term community experience zone. And it's happening all the time, and people are doing concerts and DJ experiences and going off and dancing there all the time, the same way people did in Second Life and still do. Some of the other spaces, may or may not have worked as well, or maybe only lived for a few days and then, poof off into the dust. And that's completely appropriate, right? So I was talking to one of the designers of Infinite Playa earlier today, which was built in Unreal, and serving an Unreal experience to the cloud is very difficult to do. And making that available across the globe to many different types of burners at a reasonable cost is also very difficult to do, right? So sometimes these teams were going hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt in order to create these experience zones, these metaverses. So those are significant costs that aren't easy. Again, like there was some kickback around selling the apps, and there were generally people who came in and donated to make that available for the community for free during the burn week, for example. These are very difficult economic models to make work across the board, even though we know that somewhere between 10 and 100,000 people will go to the experience if you provide it. Or if it's something that like a Beat Saber, a very magnetic game, you might get millions of players. The audience is certainly there, whether it's games, storytelling, interactive film experiences, art and performance experiences. There's certainly an engaged audience. They don't know how to find the experiences right now.
And how global do you think that this is now? I mean, do you find that
All over the world, right? So I just did an art experience in Nowhere, which is a new A-frame based cloud platform. And in Nowhere, we were hosting an art show with New York Arts. And we're going to do this actually again in December. So that art show was across 4 continents. And we're seeing lots of participants coming from, not just places like Singapore and Asia. We were getting a couple of performers coming in from Brazil, from Italy. We have generally seen robust participation in countries like Brazil and Colombia, as well as obviously throughout North America. It really depends on, is there 4G, 5G, reasonable internet access? That is where the dividing line is for many people across the
right,
globe.
accessibility is, that's an issue, obviously. I think it's interesting about Latin America because we've I mean, just in my own personal research, I've had to do this a lot, where I've had to go and research different markets, and it's amazing to me how advanced actually Latin market is in terms of picking up new technologies and new platforms. So it's super promising to hear that. And as far as some folks out here, they're part of different fandoms, and I think when we go back a little bit in the conversation to licensing, I think there are some interesting things to say about that, where you can kind of start to create some of these worlds around some of these fandoms, which I know Larry could talk forever about.
Yeah. We were talking about Star Trek.
Right, right.
I love how it often becomes a way to engage. So, like with the work we did with our special effects company, some of the things we do include making interfaces. So for Star Trek, that means clear touch screens inside the Enterprise for some of the J.J. Abrams films and things like that, or wearables, helmets, those sorts of things, and tangible devices that people often want to be able to put on in a virtual world, right? So if you give people the opportunity to put on Tron helmets, they often get excited. Or you take a model that was from a movie and you make it available in a virtual world, people get excited. There's an opportunity to sort of go behind the scenes virtually. And I think there are many ways in which the immersive experience zone that has become very popular as part of, it's a film release strategy, or Stranger Things right now is actually the hottest in LA. But having this kind of strategy translate to virtual worlds is becoming more common. So Lovecraft Country, for example, HBO built in VR chat, both the Sanctum experience and then a series of performances that were amazing. So that's both intimate, but also again streaming to YouTube and making people like Janelle Monáe available to a whole new audience.
Right, and I think there's also space for, again, user-generated content around different fandoms, and because it is, it's fan art, so to speak. You're in a situation where you can potentially avoid some of those liabilities of using creative IP that is owned by a third party.
Right. I've encouraged filmmakers to consider, and there's a film group in LA that I know is considering this with one of their films, which is a cult classic, and there's a lot of fan art. And so they were asking what would be the fun thing to do. I was like, you should make a social VR world with your fan art and let people play in your world, because that's what they really want to do, is they want to play in your world. And so if you can make it as weird as your brain is, if you're a outlandish filmmaker or someone who's specializing in animation or surrealism, those translate really well. And I've been shocked at the lack of awareness in terms of companies like Nickelodeon, for example, really hasn't taken advantage of this at all yet. And many companies have been slow to come into these kinds of spaces, whether they are, certainly in the children's media space, there is reluctance because of the dangers of interaction with children.
Well, yeah, I worked with, as a consultant for Hasbro back in the day, and that was always a huge concern. But also, they tend to kind of be a little bit late to the game. They have had a very long history of sort of, sit back and suck your thumb entertainment. No offense to them, and they've had a hard time transitioning to sort of this interactive world and the possibilities of interaction that are available through AR and VR. I think they'll come to it, but I do think that, surprisingly, we tend to think like this is the perfect material, but for whatever reason, they tend to kind of have a traditional outlook about what children are capable of consuming, especially in VR. There's a lot of paranoia about,
There is.
right,
But
the
that
age
means
range.
there's
Right?
also a lot of good research that now we can build on, right? So whether
Right.
that's, the great people at Sesame Workshop in terms of gaming and interaction design, or, I've done a lot of consulting in both wearables and looking at, let's say, safety wearables. In Medellin, Colombia, we were looking at safety wearables for young people using the same technology that Disney has in the Magic Band that you would wear through the theme park, but making that available to young people to get home safely and to be able to use transit throughout the city, and making safety wearables that also provide, basic payments infrastructure. Because, some cities, let's say Hong Kong, for example, with the Octopus system, already provide this. We have not made that available for most people around the world. So again, it's figuring out how do we make all of these juicy interactions happen. And it's often at the local level with local creators, building local markets, bringing together these technologies. Sometimes that's just a matter of getting people together. And social VR is one of the great ways that we begin to cross-pollinate. What I haven't seen enough of is the sort of cross-pollination. Some of it's via meetups right now, but definitely across borders, being able to see more like active collaboration in social VR spaces. And this is a hard problem. I think most platforms really aren't designed for collaboration right now.
Right. Well, with that, I would like to break this out into our Q&A with the audience. Larry, if you could, let's see if we can enable sound for our live audience who'd like to ask Ivo some questions.
Great. So, Ivo, you mentioned a platform built in A-frame called Nowhere. Is that what it was called, or was there something else there?
Nowhere. The
Nowhere.
URL currently is yournowhere.com.
Great. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Maybe over to the left here in the center, right at the center table.
Thanks. A couple of interesting things. One of my friends actually works at Nowhere, and another thing that resonated with me that you mentioned is like how all these creators, a lot of us are just like spending hundreds and thousands of dollars and not really like it's a labor of love for us, and I kind of feel like I'm one of them. But one of my main questions is, what do you think of like the whole crypto art scene and how that's interacting with XR? Because I heard a lot of talk of how like creators can kind of like monetize these platforms, monetize these experiences, especially in an open, fair, distributed way without gatekeepers. And I'm seeing like the numbers that we're seeing in terms of like the crypto art market on Ethereum, on OpenSea, on all these like crazy new platforms. And some of these events are just being run in XR as well, like just VR chat events that kind of do crypto art sales, crypto art auctions. And then you have the distributed platforms like Crypto Voxels, Decentraland, Somnium Space, all of these other just virtual worlds that are basically like just kind of like skyrocketing in value, and almost like the market of that is becoming almost as large as the entire VR market right now. And I'm seeing like this really crazy inflection point where these two worlds can kind of like collide, and like everybody can kind of like help each other as creators. So my question is, what do you think of like the crypto art scene and like where that's going, and how do you see that kind of evolving?
Well, so far, I have not spent as much of my direct time selling crypto art. I have been in the strategy and early phase of development of the platforms. So I was an advisor to one of the ones you mentioned. I was also a part of some of the other blockchain fan engagement platform design projects. Um, these are great ways to build engaged communities. For some artists, they're a great way to get to a whole new market. Um, whether it's sort of primary way to go, I don't know. I had a lot of problems in the crypto industry, and I kind of stepped back from it in terms of unwanted people in my life, right? So scammers and getting hacked. I had to avoid certain platforms altogether. So it is hit or miss. The art market in particular has been robust and amazing, both in terms of sort of shared value market, but also in being able to do limited edition digital releases, and having unique new ways to share content, I think is great. I think what Decentraland is doing is fantastic. And anywhere that lets you do the open science work in a way that shares ownership. There are a handful of different models that are being tested. It'll be interesting to see which one plays out as a winning combination. I'm definitely like holding Ethereum and a few. I've been mostly a passive observer, not a buyer in terms of the art market up to this phase. But we at the agency certainly have, I think it's 3 artists who are currently monetizing on the art markets.
Larry, how about do you have a comment yourself? Maybe Larry might pose a question for you, Eva. Would that be possible?
Let's go, Larry.
I'm calling you from ether.
So what do you see coming out of the COVID craziness right now? I mean, we're probably going back in for another bunch of months. Do you think that there's actually going to be an influx of money coming in, or still just people trying to sell HMDs from Oculus? I mean, do you think there's a movement that could happen while we're still in pandemic mode?
Oh yeah, there's a movement that can happen. Absolutely. There's a lot of money flowing. And there's a lot of interest, and that's global collaboration. That's figuring out how to build some of these new networks and channels. That's figuring out some of the certainly there are still a handful of interface and hardware challenges to be dealt with, but a lot of what we have ahead of us is how do we build better content strategies. Obviously, people are going to get bored with what they've got. So in year 2 of pandemic, what are they going to be doing next year? It's how do you find better live experiences? How do you get to more VR concerts effectively? How do you go and participate in as many different types of media as possible? So there's a wide open terrain of whether it's hybrid experiences. We've met with everybody from raves and festivals and pretty much everything that people love to do in the physical world. We will probably be away from at least till March, and likely through at least the first half of next year. So I suspect that there will be a lot of funding in Q1 for those who want to line up for it now.
Well, with that, I think we're about at our time. So I'd like to thank Ivo Heyning once again, as well as our studio audience for joining us tonight in the Mediaverse Lounge. Please follow us on Twitter at MediaverseL and on Twitch at twitch.tv/Mediaverse for more of the show. Where to follow Ivo Heyning, we'll put up some links about where to find her, and plus some info on how to be a guest in our live avatar audience on future episodes. There it is. She put it up there at Amoration. is her handle on Twitter, and at
my
Playable Agency. Exactly.
At
Thank you so
Playable-
much, Evo. This was like totally informative, fascinating. I feel like there's hours and hours more that we could really talk about. And we'll continue this conversation on many different platforms, hopefully. Yeah, and with that, good night and take care of yourselves. This is Blu Topalli signing off for the Mediaverse Lounge, and take care.